The first Geneijin theory is relatively simple. It's the rule of three. Now what this means is that if you are activating Geneijin 3 times, you should be able to kill your opponent. And the reason for this is because of Zenpotenshin. If you land 3 Zenpotenshins against any character in the game, it'll do approximately 85 to 100% of their life, depending on the character that you're playing against. So any residual damage that you get while actually going and obtaining the 3 Geneijins is all that it should require in order to finish out a round and kill your opponent. So the rule of 3 exists because of how Zenpotenshin scales. Depending on when you get your Zenpo inside of your Geneijin, depends on how much meter and damage that you'd get. If you do a Zenpo earlier, you're more likely to get more damage and less meter. However, the later you go, you get a little bit less damage in exchange for more meter. The idea is that you want to perpetually be able to put yourself in a situation where you can get back to Geneijin as fast as possible. So this is why you'll see a lot of young players go for Zenpo very late, because this gives you approximately 40 to 50% of your meter return. So if Ken is to block all of my stuff, it only takes 3 crouching medium punches for me to get to 55% meter. Each crouching medium punch gives 2 meter. So you're at 49 out of 50%, basically, just for getting that one ender. But how does this compare to a normal Geneijin combo? Basically, if you were to do an immediate Zenpotenshin, you end up at a very similar amount of damage. For a normal combo, if you optimize it, you'll get slightly more damage. Now, the meter that you get from this, even with 3 whiffed buttons, isn't relatively close to the 50%, because you still need another 8 meter to get there. So the meter gain for getting the combo early versus late, you get less meter, like I said before. Now the damage of the combo that I just showed is 39, and the damage of the combo that I showed beforehand with only the shoulder, crouching medium punch up kicks is 37. So the damage between these two combos is very similar. You're only within a 2-point damage differential. But if you optimize your combos, you can get quite a bit more. So when you maximize your Geneijin combo, you end up doing quite a bit more damage. This is 47 damage versus the 39 that came from the very basic combo. So you're getting almost a 33% damage increase, which is quite large. But the basic concept behind this is simple, that the damage differential between when you Zenpo, whether it's the beginning, the middle, or the end, is going to yield very similar results, where it doesn't matter when you actually go for this Zenpo, just that it actually connects. Regardless of when you do your Zenpo, whether it's 3 seconds in, or whether it's 7 seconds in, you basically get the same amount of damage in meter. 3 seconds being 36, and 7 seconds being 37. So it's a 1 damage difference with the exact same amount of meter gain. So the main concept here is that you should be making your opponent fear Zenpo at any point in your pressure. If your opponent does not fear your Zenpotenshin, they have no reason to attempt to make defense choices whatsoever. There's no reason for them to jump. There's no reason for them to, try to press buttons to interrupt your decisions. Nothing. And some players like to just take the throw, which in my opinion is stupid. But, depending on the game state and all that stuff, what your opponent likes to do doesn't matter as much, as long as there's enough variation in your timing for when you do your Zenpo that the opponent does not know exactly when you want to go for it during your pressure. So this variation is the first way that Yuns approach Geneijin, where they have an overemphasis or a strict emphasis on Zenpo and optimizing the decisions after the Zenpo. Now, the next sort of way that people emphasize things is hit confirms. Now, in a lot of situations, Yun players go for that late Zenpo, or they go for that, right in the middle of their Geneijin so that they can very easily optimize their decisions. However, the opponent, if they know that this is going to happen, is just going to be in a situation where they're going to jump your Zenpo, right? As long as they know that you're going for that, whether you hit them or not, if your goal is Zenpo and you're not going to confirm off of that one stray low that you got, your opponent doesn't have to really worry about holding up back. If you don't have the ability to confirm, then they don't have to worry about defending in that manner. So essentially, having an emphasis on confirms means that your opponent already has the fear of God in them that Zenpo is going to occur. And this usually happens at the second level of defending Geneijin, which means that this sort of a strategy does not really work unless the opponent likes to press buttons, if they like to attempt to defend against Geneijin. If they like to just sit there, then obviously you're not going to get anything. You're not going to be able to open them up, because if you're not using your Zenpo, they're just going to block everything and you've wasted your entire Geneijin. However, just like my video on actually confirming in Geneijin, you have to understand that unless you have variations to your pressure that more easily allow for you to go for these confirms, you're not going to be able to confirm off of a single hit. Even though it's plus 13, it's very hard to see that this hit and then go for forward fierce, because forward fierce is 10 frames. Or it's very hard to, see that it hits and then, press something else. Especially if your goal is just a recovery cancel to walk forward and Zenpo. So your decisions change when you're aiming for this. Your goal is to get to the point where your opponent thinks that you're going to Zenpo, and then change your pressure to add that space to allow them to make that defensive choice, and then capitalize on it. For this strategy, you have to intentionally set traps for your opponents, and you have to see how they react to them, if they take the bait or not. So it can be a little bit risky to go for these confirms, because it does give your opponent an out if you don't capitalize on it. And if they just sort of block and you have not gotten your Zenpo, depending on when you are going for these sort of confirm situations, your opponent may or may not put you in a situation where you're not going to get anything from the rest of your Geneijin. So there's risk-reward behind going for, hit confirms just as much as there is the risk-reward behind specifically going for Zenpo. So the best way to describe it is that hit confirms is the second layer of Yomi when approaching Geneijin. However, because at a higher level of play, every opponent is going to know that Zenpo is an option, some players prefer to emphasize this sort of risk-reward, where they build in these traps, whether it be frame traps or setups where the opponent knows that this is where they are likely to go for Zenpo to try to, interrupt them, whether it's to, press a button which can be option parried or frame trapped against, or trying to jump out, which obviously I've already shown that you can hit. There's a lot of ways that you can force your opponent to make these decisions. But just because you can put your opponent in a situation that forces a decision doesn't mean that you're always going to get the upper hand, and that it's going to go in your favor. Because you could go for this confirm, and they could just block it, and you get nothing. Or they could just block it and then get Zenpo'd, because that's what your goal was. To fake a situation that forces them to jump, and then they just don't respect it, and they get Zenpo'd anyway. So this is sort of like the first real layer of mind games outside of the differentiation in when you go for Zenpo and the varied timing at which that can happen. So the first overhead that people use is forward medium kick. Now, while this move is -3 even on hit, it forces your opponent into a situation where if they don't have the knowledge, then you're able to just, go right back into pressure, or you're able to, walk up Zenpo or whatever, right? But when you get to a higher level and your opponent respects things, they have to worry about option parries after the fact. And they have to worry about if their character has a fast enough move to contest crouching light kick afterward, because this has super priority. A character like Alex, where his crouching light kick or whatever might be 5 frames, matches up with the crouching light kick. But the crouching light kick will have super priority, which will beat that crouching light kick of Alex. So it's a risk for Alex to press that. But not every character has moves that aren't fast enough to beat the crouching light kick from Yun. Ken's crouching medium punch will intercept this if he goes for the forward medium kick. And this is another mind game in of itself. But that mind game actually evolves, because when you're using forward medium kick, and your opponent knows that crouching light kick may come next, it's a good option for them to down parry. However, when you do this, you can immediately go into high pressure as well. So that parry becomes a risk just as much as it becomes a good decision. Because although this is Yun's fastest move after the fact, it doesn't mean that he has to use that move. One of the important things to understand here is that forward medium kick and universal overhead are both 13 frame startup moves. So they're essentially the equivalent of a Dudley dart shot, which is right at the brink of human reaction time. So although technically you can react to it, it's very hard in the moment to react, unless you are specifically looking for those things. Now it's up to the Yun to generate situations that don't give away their intention to do overhead. So forward medium kick is a complement to the rule of 3. And what I mean by this is that it does 10 damage every time. So, if your opponent can't react to this consistently, then there's a very good chance that you're just going to get free damage. Because if you land 2 of these, if you end up waiting until your, Zenpo is almost done, you've done 33% of your opponent's life as opposed to 25. So just the little extra bits of damage that you can get matter. But the reason why this tool in particular can be so strong is because it cancels off of so many different things in different situations. So you have forward fierce, you have far medium or close medium, you have crouching medium kick, or you have crouching light kick. You have the ability to walk and then do it, because if you're far away, walking and doing this makes just as much sense as walking and going low, because this will go over a low attack in a lot of situations, but it does lose to some fast attacks like Chun's down jab, where it will hit the startup of this move. So this also comes down to the opponent's ability to react. If you're playing against, MOV or Justin or something, and they're able to see this and react with that Chun down jab, that's great. But not every character has the ability to press something that's going to beat that forward medium kick. So it's a matchup dependent tool and a player dependent tool. So to go more in depth as to the matchup dependent stuff, this move is not something that you would use against Hugo, because your -3 and SPD is only a 2 frame startup, or his super Gigas is a 0 frame startup. So if you are not holding up immediately after this, you're just gonna get grabbed. It's not a question of if you're going to get grabbed, you're gonna get grabbed. So using this move sort of negates the usefulness of things unless that player has the tendency to just down back and not try to punish things. And on parry, you're gonna put yourself in a bad situation anyway, because your opponent parried you. You're going to either get back thrown or you're going to have something occur that's going to eat the rest of your Geneijin. So the next tool is Universal Overhead. Because you're going to get about 40% of your opponent's life from a Universal Overhead combo or more, depending on when you do it and how optimized your decisions are. So this is more damage than you would get off of a Zenpo. However, depending on the situation, you can force Proximity Guard, and you can make your opponent block, essentially, the Universal Overhead, even though they can't block it, and then Zenpo them. So this tool has a lot of different ways that it can be used, but if you use it too close, you don't get anything off of it. So it's very spacing dependent, which means it's easier to read when it's going to happen. Now, because of this, though, getting to that space, if your opponent is looking for the Universal Overhead or the forward medium kick, then it opens them up for that Zenpo. So having an emphasis on overheads means that they can just immediately go back to using Zempos if they so choose. But, having an emphasis on overheads, can be very strong against players that just like to down back, because you end up getting, quite a bit more damage than you would off of a Zenpo. I have an entire video talking about frame traps and how they function as far as going into hit confirms and all that stuff, so I do suggest watching that as far as to understand how this goes, but I'll do a very brief overview. The concept is that there are a couple moves in this game, or for Yun, which give you just enough plus frames, usually around +6 to +9, which forces your opponent, if they're doing an option select during your pressure, that they will easily get hit if they choose to continue this option select. Be it mashing a button as they're blocking, trying to guard jump, or any other sort of option select that they can go for. So this is why you'll see players like Boss do something like this. Because they're looking for the +6 situation off of Dekai, and then they're going low again. So depending on how long they wait between the Dekai and the crouching medium kick afterward, means that it will either be a guaranteed block string, or it will be a frame trap. So this occurs off of other moves like close standing medium punch. It also occurs off of crouching medium kick, because this is only +7, and then standing light kick, which is +9. So you'll see situations where they'll intentionally use a move that is very much so easy to confirm after the fact, because you're using those plus frames to get a launcher. Whether it's a close standing medium kick, or a guaranteed thing into Dekai, or, just Dekai into Dekai. Something that gives you a lot of time to see that your opponent becomes airborne and allows you to continue your combo that way. There are quite a lot of variations as far as what things will allow you to frame trap, like shoulder, and basically producing situations that your opponent knows that they have an opportunity to escape if the Yun decides to, take too much of a time between their decisions. So as an example, Yun can do this, and if he varies the crouching medium kick timing at all, Ken can just, DP it. And this is very much character dependent. So against certain characters you have more or less to worry about as far as if they're going to attempt to parry out, or, whatever other situation that may occur. If Dudley parries this, you're going to get standing roundhouse into EX machine gun blow, all of your meters gone, and you just ate 30 to 40% of your life, maybe into a hard knockdown and maybe into more damage. So it's one of those things where there is definitely a risk behind it, but the reward is very high, just like it is off of the Universal Overhead. The difference for frame traps, in my opinion, is that while frame traps can be used mid-screen, they're usually not. And the reason for this is because frame traps mid-screen are usually done into confirms, where frame traps in the corner are usually done into something that will hard launch. Whether that hard launch is, doing a crouching medium kick or a crouching light kick into medium punch shoulder, or, doing something into Dekai. But just like overheads, frame traps can also put you in very good situations to go for Zenpo. Because all of the moves, because they are only a little bit less plus than you would get off of a crouching light kick, this being +4 or whatever, you're able to move towards your opponent faster, which means that your opponent has to react to that movement or see that that is going to come or predict that it's going to come and then make their defensive choice a lot earlier. And if they're option selecting, that option select will probably beat your Zenpo, but they also have to risk getting hit if they go for these option selects as well. So just like every other thing, it's a double-edged sword when trying to defend against Geneijin. Adding jumps to your pressure and emphasizing the strings that will allow you to do these jumps efficiently is something that some players like to do. It was a lot more common back in the day, but there are still some of the strongest players that do this quite a bit. Like Mester, Yakun does it, Ushi does it at times, Derun, I've seen Issei do it. There's a lot of players that do these jump mix-ups to great effect. So although jumping isn't really quite an emphasis, it's something that players use more often than others. And the options that they get here are varied quite a bit. They get jump-ins, they get stuff like this, where they get a whiff dive kick, or they get dive kicks that can hit their opponent. So this depends on how good the opponent is at reacting to things, and it depends on, what sort of decisions the Yun wants to make. Because it sets up quite a lot of decisions that you can make. And your opponent can actually stand and, contest these decisions. They can stand and block them. But they're still going to be put into that sort of set play situation that you get off of forcing a frame trap and having variations in your decisions that makes them maybe want to go for that jump, or it makes them want to guard jump or whatever. There's a lot of choices that you get, where you can set up Zenpo in a lot of different ways, or you can simply jump at your opponent and get it confirmed. So this is very much like using the universal overhead. It functions in a very similar way, but your opponent has more time to react. This means that you have a lot of different variations that you can do, from things like jump in target combo or jump in dive kick. Because you can choose to whiff a dive kick that looks like it may hit or not. That was a medium kick dive kick, which if I had recovery canceled that far standing heavy punch, would hit. So because there's a lot of ways that you can vary your decisions, your opponent has a lot to worry about. Whether you're going to complete your target combo or not is something they have to think about. And the timing at which you're going to do this as well. You can delay quite a bit, and if they decide to, think that you're going to use this as a way to go for a tick Zenpo, essentially, then if they, option select to jump, then that second hit may just hit them, right? And that's very hard to do with this training mode, so to speak. So it's not something that I can show, but the concept is there. There are a lot of varied ways that you can do this, where you can put yourself in situations like using forward medium kick into far standing medium punch to force a jump, Or you can do anything into forward fierce, far fierce, or very far like crouching medium kicks. So there's a lot of different ways that you can go into these situations. Like you can do it just straight off of shoulder as well. But if you're doing it straight off of shoulder, there's certain mix-ups that may or may not work based on spacing. So this is one of those things that gets pulled out every so often, and there are some players that like to emphasize this more than others. Resets can be important, and the reason for this is because of how the damage scales inside of Geneijin and the meter scaling. However, some players prefer resets and some players prefer corner carry. So this is very much I prefer meter and damage for a little bit of risk versus no risk and guaranteed knockdown and positioning. This concept is pretty simple. The idea is that you want to emphasize positioning and you want to emphasize consistency, which means that in situations like this where you're going from corner to corner, you're going to take the most optimal routes to go from one side of the screen to the other, getting as much damage and meter as you can from this situation, and just getting the positioning and tempo of the match that you want. When you're keeping things safe and consistent, you're doing combos that essentially are relatively optimal, but they're not as optimal as can be. And the main goal is to get consistency, positioning, and to stay as risk averse as possible. So you'll be seeing players do like shoulder, 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 and while in some situations this may be the most optimal combo, it's not always going to be. So as an example, if I do a different combo against him, this is quite a bit more damage. However, it requires him to be crouching, whereas the other one requires him to be standing. And this is where the damage scaling and the options come in. You may or may not be able to get the highest damage combo, and some players choose to add in resets and risk in order to get more damage and more meter. But when you're taking consistency and you're taking positioning as your main goal, this applies to everything that Yun can do. So as an example, if you're just in the mid-screen, you could do up kicks and get set play against certain characters. That can be very powerful. However, in the same vein, you can just go for crouching medium kick dash punch and then, dash up, dive kick up, whatever it is that you want to do, and get that corner carry. It's the same thing where, you could get something into 1, 2, 3 up kicks, or you could just simply back throw to get the positioning off the parry. So this isn't just a Geneijin thing, it's a player decision thing. And not every player makes the same choices. They're not all comfortable with risk-reward behind some of the situations that may occur. The only thing that happens is that when you get, that knockdown from the end of Geneijin, you have the choice to go for your Okizeme, or you can just back off and build meter or whatever it is that you want to do. As long as you're comfortable building meter and contesting your opponent and keeping them in the corner, then this may be the decision for you, if that's where you find that your strengths lie. But if you are a little bit more willing to take risks for higher gains, then going for resets might be worth it for you. When you're going for consistency, especially against a standing opponent, the damage can be quite a bit lower. So you may only get 40% of your opponent's life versus like 45. And you get very little meter return. But what happens if we add a reset in that is successful? When you are aiming to reset your opponent, you may not get more damage. You may get very similar damage, but look at the meter gain. As opposed to getting 20%, I'm now at 55%. So this allows me to maintain the ability to get, Geneijin off of a single good decision. So you can Zenpo, and you can still reset off of this as well. You can stay in the front, and you can also make it very ambiguous if you're going to go left or right. But it can be a little bit difficult to get the timing on this consistently. And you can hold left to go to the back, or you can tap right at any time to go back to the front. It's a very high risk, high reward decision where you give your opponent the ability to get out, but you give yourself more damage than you would get from that Zenpo, and definitely a lot more meter than you would have gotten. When you actually get this to work, though, it pays off in spades. The damage difference here versus a normal combo is very minimal, but look at the damage, the meter that you get. You get close to 80%. Because you'll easily have gotten 2 crouching medium punches after the fact, so you're at about 80% meter. And that's for taking that bit of a risk. You don't really lose a whole lot of damage, but you gain a lot in momentum. Whether you're going into the corner or mid-screen, your resets are just as potent. Because you're putting yourself in a situation where you're going to get just as much meter as you would have if your opponent was cornered, or if you're going from one side of the screen to the other. Doesn't matter. Doesn't matter if you start mid-screen or not. If you can get to the corner relatively efficiently, great, do that. But that's where the differentiation between players and the type of resets that they do comes into play. Knowing exactly the screen position that they're at, how to optimize what resets to go for and when, how early in their, combo they need to do it to most optimize the meter or damage, or even just deciding, hey, I'm going to let them fall completely. You get quite a bit from both decisions. There are some riskier options as well, where you can go for, Kara crouching roundhouse after Daipon loop against a lot of the casts as well. And then you'll get situations like, where you're able to go right to the other side, or you're able to stay in front, and then they have to guess high-low, or they have to guess empty Zenpo. So there's a lot of things that they need to worry about for all of these different resets. And because of the sheer amount of variation that can occur, this is what makes that risk-reward viable for a lot of players. Now, if you want more information on resets, I actually have a series on them on my YouTube, so feel free to check those videos out. When you get to the highest level players, a majority of them don't stick to just one sort of emphasis. They've played long enough that they know that you need to incorporate multiple different approaches into your Geneijin, otherwise it's going to become stale and easily predictable. So even if you are very good at making it so that your Zenpo is unreadable as to when you're going to do it, and you've maximized all of your decisions off of it, your opponent is eventually going to decide that they want to try to jump that Zenpo, and your confirming is going to be great. Or if you know that you're able to get those Zempos, then using the overheads become worth using. Whether you're able to use forward medium kicks to just get a little bit more damage, or get those universal overheads to get full combos. In the same vein, your opponent's going to want to stop you from Zenpoing, they're going to be pressing buttons, they're going to try to jump. So you get frame traps. Or they like to stay grounded, and you are going for these hit confirms or frame traps, but you're pushing yourself a little far away, so they add jumps. And the only difference is that some players like to keep things consistent and like to always get that corner pressure, like to always get the consistent damage, and they don't like to take the risks of going for resets while other players do. And these risk-reward analysis that players do also change a lot based on if they're in tournament, what the stakes on the line are. You know, there's a lot of things that go into the decision making of the player, and all of that stuff is variable. So emphasizing one particular aspect of Geneijin, may be something that someone prefers to do. Ushi may prefer hit confirms, but he has very, very, very good understanding of how to use those hit confirm sort of setups that they do to go for optimized Zenpo decisions at particular portions of the Geneijin meter. Or certain players might know exactly when is best to go for universal overheads, or how to space things to get universal overheads that force the opponent to, guess block high and then get hit low. There's a lot of things that come into play when sort of rounding out your Geneijin style. And it's more about figuring out what you prefer your main way of getting damages, and then how to sprinkle in the other variations and other decisions to make it really hard for your opponent to always know what you're going to do. They can know that you're going to want a Zenpo, but they don't know when that Zenpo is coming. They can know that you're going to want to hit confirm, but, oh, you've Zenpo'd them, or you've done a universal overhead. If they know you want to Zenpo, and you add frame traps, or if they know you want a Zenpo and they're not looking for the jump or the overhead. All of these are intertwined, where they all matter equally. And all of these ways that you can approach your opponent and all the ways that you can mix them up go with one another very well. They all basically make each other better. Without one, the other isn't as strong. And that's the one thing to understand, is that you can't have one single emphasis at the very highest level. But as you're developing your Geneijin, you can choose to decide how you want to approach getting your damage, maximize that, and then learn to add the other things in as things go along. All of the top Yuns have very balanced decisions. Ushi, Yakun, Sho, Derun, Issei, Boss, tons of players all have their own styles of Geneijin that encompass all of these different aspects, and how much they use each varies depending on the player. But no option is out of their mind. Some players are better at things than others, and some players use specific options more than others. Some may be more successful than others. But that doesn't mean that they don't know what exists and how it can be used. They just know what works best for them. It's all about your own identity, which is something even myself I struggle with. When you're approaching full screen, there's a couple ways that you can deal with things. Some players like to set up dash punches that are at perfect spaced. Some players like to vary things with shoulders. Some players like to jump at their opponent. Some players like to neutral jump dive kick. Depends on the character that they're playing against and the player that they're playing against. But for the most part, Yuns do have a very specific way that they like to approach things, and it varies depending on the player. One of the first ways that you can approach your opponent is with crab walk. Now, this can be very hard to do, so I have another video on how to crab walk, but as you can see here, if your opponent tries to jump away and you're able to crab walk in time, you can confirm off of that far medium punch that ends up happening. The next major way people approach things is with dive kicks and with jumps. So they'll do like empty super jumps or normal jumps into dive kicks, which will allow you to go for that high-low mix-up. Alternatively, you can just walk at your opponent, and then you can mix that single jump in and make a dive kick or, empty jump or whatever it is that you want to do, or a jump in normal, depending on the screen position, and go from there. The other way is with dash punch, where at certain positionings you can get a dash punch that will hit your opponent and allow you to continue your combo. So this is the goal. However, a lot of times people will be a little bit too close and will either be hoping to catch their jumping, or will be, a little bit too close and will end up hitting the opponent where multiple hits will hit instead of just one, which gives the opponent more times to parry, and is usually what your opponent will do. They'll try to parry multiple times. Now, there are situations where you'll use specific moves to pull the screen in a specific situation, hoping that they're going to walk back or dash back or whatever, so that the dash punch will hit at the exact particular spacing that you want it to. And this is used by a lot of very high-level yuns. So you can mix things in a lot of different ways, right? You can use your jumps, you can use your dash punches, you can use your shoulders, and what a lot of people don't understand as well is that if your opponent is just standing still, which I'll let this run out, but if your opponent is just standing still, then you can do things like Kara forward fierce at specific ranges, or you can use Kara fierce or Kara crouching medium kick. Because at very specific ranges, this will hit your opponent. So this is something that a lot of yuns will also do off of crab walk, whether they'll use the crab walk into forward fierce or crab walk into, Kara crouching medium kick or whatever it is. But there's a lot of variation in ways that you can approach your opponent, and sometimes patience is virtue.